Hi, and welcome to the third installment of our COMM309 Health Communication Summary Lecture Series. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, which is all on social support. And today I am also introducing something new. I don't know if I'll need it the whole time. I'm introducing a timer for myself because I really don't want these to go longer than 15 minutes. So another thing I've done, I've tried to cut down on the amount of content I'm talking about this week to try to go a little bit more in depth. But I still want you to read and pick up on all the things that are in your chapter that maybe I don't want to cover here because I don't want you to get distracted. So please, try to pay attention to the things I'm talking about here, but also fill in the gaps with the things that you don't hear me talk about with your readings. Okay, so social support. We've kind of already been talking about this a little bit, right? When we talked about caregiver communication, how it's important for caregivers to receive social support themselves, but also, of course, be there for social support. So we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms of social support in these caregiving situations. But first, why is it even important? What specifically is it about social support that's so important in a health communication context? We know from years and years of research that social support actually has positive mental and physical health benefits. So this isn't just something that is a nice thing to have. It can actually have a direct impact on how we're feeling, again, mentally and physically. We think this is because of stress. We think that social support has a really important role in stress reduction, and there's actually two models that your book brings up of why that is, right? Two different reasons that two different ways that social support could actually help and reduce stress. One of the models, the buffering model, talks about how stress is actually, the negative effects of stress are actually sort of like walled against if you have a large social support network, okay? So if you feel like you have a lot of social support, then some of the negative effects of stress will be buffered against. So you might actually be experiencing stress, but your body will have more resilience, okay, against any sort of negative effects that could happen. The other model, though, says that social support can actually have a more direct effect on actually reducing the negative effects of stress. So let's take a negative effect like reduced immunity. We know that when people get really stressed out, they tend to have reduced immune levels, making them more susceptible to other types of sicknesses and things like that. Well, the direct effects model would say that the reason that social support is so important is because it can actually beat that negative outcome of stress, so that people who might be experiencing reduced immunity, if they have a little more social support, could actually get a boost in immunity. Okay, so it's a more direct impact. But again, I think that the main takeaway message about why this is even an important area to study is because not only can it help people cope with their illness, there's actually some evidence to suggest that it can actually help the illness itself. And this makes a lot of sense. You know, humans are social beings, and in my opinion, it's not very surprising that we would sort of be hardwired to respond positively, very positively, to having those around us who love and support us. On the flip side, you could say that we are hardwired to respond very negatively if we are lacking that, if we are feeling lonely or isolated. So any type of social connection can be very important, particularly if we're dealing with some sort of illness or very stressful life event. Okay, one of the things I thought was kind of interesting, surprising even, is that your chapter doesn't talk a lot about like specific strategies on like, okay, well, what's the best way to give, what's the best way to provide different types of social support that they talk about, and they outline a number of different types. I'm not going to go into that, but one of the big take-home messages I think about the best way to administer it is this idea of a comforting message. Okay, so just provide messages that make people feel comfortable. Well, specifically, they talk about comforting messages being messages that accomplish two different things. First of all, they express concern. Okay, so it's a message that lets the other person know that you sincerely care about them and that you're concerned about them or whatever they're going through. But secondly, a comforting message accomplishes validation. It helps people feel like whatever emotions they're going through, feelings they're going through, thoughts they're having are legitimized. This is different than actually agreeing with what somebody says, okay? Or even empathizing. We talked a lot how, empathetic communication is very important. But even if you can't understand how somebody feels, or even if you don't experience the same emotions, a comforting message is only about saying, I understand why you feel that way. It makes sense that you would feel that way. So in that way, it's actually a little bit easier than some of the other types of communication behaviors that we were talking about. The physician needs to also legitimize patient concerns, right? But we're not even going up to the step of empathy, although of course that is another way of legitimizing it. But really, you don't have to actually experience what somebody's feeling in order to validate how they're feeling. So, and like everything, this is not just good advice for health communication context. It's great advice for any type of relationship that you're dealing with. Okay, how am I doing on time? iPhone doesn't do it. Okay, we're good. I'm going to hit some other issues about, now that we've gotten through it. So that's the strategy of social support that I want to talk about. But now I want to talk about sort of where social support comes from and where might be the best place to access it. And your book talks about social networks, not social network sites. I always tell my students when I teach media classes, we've been studying social networks for a long time. Humans have always lived in social networks. We've always had them. And we've always understood that they have different effects on our behavior and our feelings and things like social support. A lot of research on social support sort of delineates different types of ties that we have with other people. So a tie would be just a connection with other people. And some of those connections are strong. We have strong ties. And some of those connections are weak ties. The strong ties tend to be the people that we're most intimate with. Family members, right? They're with us. They know us very well. Kind of hard to get rid of, right? They're family. I don't mean to be so derogatory about that, but or very, very close friends. And we can usually only have, there's something called the Dunbar number that suggests that we can really only have a certain number of strong ties because it takes a lot of social grooming to maintain those connections with people who, again, are demanding in the sense that you know a lot about them and they know a lot about you, okay? There's also, though, weak ties, which are more common because they're less demanding. You can have a lot of interaction with a lot of acquaintances, a lot of weak ties. People who you might be friendly with. You could even consider your friend, but not your best friends or your close friends, okay? So these would be coworkers and colleagues, other students, people in your general social network who you're aware of and acquainted with, but not necessarily deeply connected with. Interestingly, because of social network sites, which have sort of expanded the number of people that we can be aware of in our social networks, some people have suggested that we can also have absent ties, which are those people who you actually don't have communication with. Maybe you were friends with them in high school, but you haven't talked to them in years and years and years, but you're sort of still aware of them because they're in your peripheral, right? Because you see them on your social network, but they're still absent because you're really not tied to them. They're not true friends, Anyway, the interesting thing is that the research suggests that even though you might expect that your strong ties would be best for social support, they are in the long term. Okay, so if you're dealing with a terminal illness or something that you're going through that's going to require some major commitment, strong ties are very useful for that. But they're not as good at providing social support in other ways, and part of that is because a lot of these relationships are already have a lot of obligation, and so there's more hesitance. Some of the things we talked about with caregiver communication, where caregivers don't like to burden people, right? And people who are sick might not like to burden their caregiver. Same sort of thing going on here, where the communication lines might be cut off a little bit precisely because these people know you so well. What were some other things? Let's see. They also, if you have family, you'll understand, sometimes people who know each other very well also tend to minimize the concerns of the people who they're most close with. That's because they know you. So they're like, oh, you're always like that, you know. Oh, you always exaggerate when you're sick. You know, those types of things that's a strong tie response and not a weak tie response. Weak ties are much better and possibly more willing to talk about certain things because they don't have that same level of investment. It's not as big a deal for them. It's not as much of a burden for them. So in many ways, weak ties are the most the best people to sort of provide the types of social support that you might be needing if you want to talk about certain issues you're going through, right? It's almost because of the lack of commitment and attachment that it makes weak ties an easier place to go for that type of social support. I should mention that one thing that sort of bothered me was that in the examples in your book, they only talk about strong ties as family. They acknowledge that it can be close friends too, but in all the examples, it seemed to be about family. But, you know, your close friends also are considered strong ties too. And I think that anybody who has like a close friend who's a confidant would say that they are pretty sure that person would provide great social support, and no denying that. Again, sometimes it has to do with just like long-term versus short-term. Oh, they also mentioned that, yes, that's right. Weak ties are better if you are dealing with maybe an illness you're less familiar with and you need a lot of information or knowledge on a particular topic, because that's why we have these social networks, right? We can access all of these resources through the people that we're connected to, and things that your family might not really understand or whatever, because everybody's sort of like very alike in your strong tie network. Maybe you can access more if you go out through your weak ties. So, okay, so finally I wanted to talk though about just one more, see how I'm doing. I won't do this every time, I promise. Okay, still got a few minutes. About the concept of support groups, which is, you know, really something that you would do to access social support if you are going outside of your social network. So there would be these groups designed specifically for support. I always think of the ones in Fight Club as an example. The question is why would people go to these? The truth is, if you think about it, support groups kind of have a bad rap. Alcoholics Anonymous, right? It's kind of like, oh, you're in the 12-step program. So I don't think that's a good thing, and I'll talk about that in a second, but why do people tend to seek out support groups instead of just going through their network? Well, there's a couple of reasons I wrote down while I was reading. The one that sticks out the most, I think, is the stigmatization, right? Support groups are particularly good if you are dealing with some sort of issue that is very embarrassing or is maybe stigmatized in society. One of the best examples, and I might bring this up on the discussion board, is actually anorexia and bulimia. And online support groups have become sort of a controversial place where people with anorexia and bulimia, which of course is frowned upon, can come and talk about their illness with other people who have with other people who are suffering from anorexia or bulimia. And they're called pro-ana groups because it's like pro-anorexia. And some people do actually advocate anorexia as sort of like as a lifestyle choice versus an illness, and that's why it's controversial. But there's a lot of benefits that can come out of talking to somebody who's going through what you're going through, especially if you're trying to recover. Talking to doctors or family who might be very judgmental can actually make recovery harder in some cases. Okay, that's my 2-minute mark. I'll finish up. So anyway, we'll tease that out a little bit more, but think about some of the benefits that can come out of, even for sort of, I guess you could say, controversial illnesses, right? Of having people that can understand where you're coming from and being able to get together with them, as opposed to somebody who you feel like might be judging you. Also, though, like sometimes, as we keep talking about, people in your relationships, whether they're strong ties or weak ties, might feel uncomfortable talking about some things because they just don't like talking about mortality or illness and things that you need to be talking about. A social support group could actually help you do that. But the problem is that right now, you know, the only people that go to support groups tend to be white, middle class, educated, and women tend to go in greater frequency. And I do think this is a shame, and I think it suggests that for some reason there's a bad taste in people's mouth about support groups. And I'd be interested actually to hear your opinions on why that is too. Like, what is it about support groups that seems like something that people should hide in themselves when really support is such a natural thing to seek? So, okay, I think I did it. Under 15 minutes, barely. Okay, bye.